I have three esteemed colleagues here on stage, and you have their bios in your packet, so I won't take too much time to introduce them. I'll just give you names and titles. So first, Rick Hess, who's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you. Stephen Hodas, who's the executive director of the New York City Department of Education, the Office of Innovation. And C. Massey, former president of NSBA, and lots of other powerful titles that I read in his bio. So the discussion today, I think, is going to focus more or less on the word coherence. And I'm going to open with a quote from a blog I wrote this past summer in the Huffington Post for the Aspen Institute, and get the reaction from our panelists, and then go on and talk much more about what we can do to support school systems across the country. So let me start with this quote from the blog. Complex problems require comprehensive solutions. Partial reforms have led to partial transformation. System leaders have improved instruction, developed principles, improved school accountability systems, expanded school choice, and brought more successful and innovative models, including charters to cities. However, these initiatives are often implemented separately rather than integrated into a system-wide strategy. I call it the Frankenstein's monster syndrome. These reforms have improved many schools, but the way in which they've been implemented have left us with inconsistent results and incoherent systems. So you heard earlier from two superintendents, and by nature smart superintendents are systemic people. They look to find ways of connecting pieces together. The question for the panel is, why do we have so many islands of success? Why is the Frankenstein's monster syndrome so prevalent across our systems, across the country? Ed, why don't you start, since you...
Sure, thank you for having me. I come from a little bit of a different perspective. I'm a school board member and have been for a number of years. And through that opportunity, I've not only seen things work at the local level, but the state level as well as the national level. And I think the reason there's a lot of incoherence, if you will, is that the systems just don't work together. There's a struggle for control, a struggle for power that can actually be within the district or within the state, and even from state to state. For example, in my district, which is a rather large district for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, we have about 20,000 students, and we have 23 schools. But for years, our schools weren't even aligned. In Kentucky, we have a unique factor because we have school site-based councils. So each school has its own governance model that's made up of the principal, 3 teachers, and 2 parents. And how they implement their curriculum might be different than a school that implements their curriculum that's only 10 or 15 miles away. And so when you have those kind of structures, they run their own directions, and then you have to bring them together. And so as a district, what we've tried to do over the last 10 years or so is to work on vertical and horizontal alignment within our district. So we set up cluster meetings between the schools, so the elementary schools will all meet, the middle schools and high schools, and then we will have representatives from each of those teams meet with district personnel, so we have vertical alignment. And the idea is that we will use our alignment for implementation of our technology and the implementation of curriculum so that schools will be moving in the same direction instead of pushing and pulling against one another. We found that since we've done that, we have happier employees, we have a technology plan that is extended and visionary and is working. We have students that can move from one school to another and really never miss a beat on the basis of accountability. And so I think that we're trying to now take what we've learned from that and replicate that with some other districts within our state. And I think we have to quit condemning those around us and start working with those around us in an effort to see that alignment work, because at the end of the day, it's all about educating our students.
So you see the solution coming from the districts themselves in terms of creating coherence?
Correct.
Perfect. Stephen?
Yeah. Oh, I should say, by the way, I'm no longer with the New York City Department of Ed, so these are my own my own opinions here. But I just want to underline what you're saying. That what can look like incoherence, and when it's done badly, it can be incoherence. Actually, there needs to be diversity and difference in the way things are implemented, and it needs to be organic. within the culture of a school and within the culture of the district. And I think we get the worst results actually when we have this notion that we have an infallible template that was developed somewhere up here, and all we need to do is kind of drive it down through each successive layer of the organization. I think being thoughtful about what the differences need to be actually leads to things that work much better.
Great.
Sure. I mean, I think there's this question of coherence inside when we talk about these islands of excellence, and questions of coherence outside, and I think challenges are different. If you're talking about like inside a school or inside a district, you expect some degree of leadership coherence. I mean, that's kind of the point. But in those cases, we've got both to deal with the fact that principals or superintendents often have a limited number of arrows in their quiver as far as bringing alignment to bear. They have limited ability to make the staffing decisions in their organizations. They have limited ability to promote or reward people who are doing good work. They have limited ability to move out people who don't fit as part of that team. And it's also the fact that we've got some strange kind of mindset issues. You go into any district and people talk about we're on the instructional side or we're on the operations side. And I have no earthly idea how you run an effective integrated organization when the people who are doing teaching and learning think of their job as discrete from the people who are managing money or setting the hiring protocols. So that's internal. External, I have no idea what we mean usually when we talk about trying to bring coherence to bear. The people who are running one school district in the state of Maryland aren't in charge of another school district in the state of Maryland. The superintendent of Maryland, Lillian Lowry, is a terrific woman, but has little or no power to actually make change happen in any given district, much less a particular school. So we have 14,000 districts, we have 100,000 schools. The only way you're actually going to get coherence across all of those is if you wind up putting enough power and authority into somebody's hands to be in charge of all of that. And I think, at least in my case, that scares the living heck out of me. So I kind of prefer incoherence to what it would take to bring that kind of big picture uniformity.
I think one thing that I just want to comment on that's very true that we did in Kentucky is we sensed exactly what you're saying. And so in our community in Northern Kentucky, we created this group called the Northern Kentucky Education Action Team. And it was a group of not only community members, but educators, the Chamber of Commerce, and businesses. We began to meet with our legislators and said, how can we work together to make a flow work? And that blossomed into what we call the Kentucky Educational Action Team, or KEAT. That has had a very big influence in working with our Department of Education without giving that control to one person. Because when the legislators have learned that educators who not only are made up of teachers and administrators, but also the influence they have over parents, have a tremendous voice in advocacy, it's allowed us to put some structures in place that allowed each school to maintain its own identity and its own creativity, but have allowed us on core concepts to move forward. So I think that's a very good point.
And Rick mentioned just in passing something, what we were talking about before, where I think is really dangerous in coherence, is this idea within a district that you have folks who are involved in education, and then you have folks who are involved in ops. And it's precisely those ops functions around procurement and contracting and IT and compliance. Those folks are not typically accountable for educational outcomes, and yet the decisions they make very much drive how effective the instructional people can be.
And Rick, I can understand the worry about too much coherence on the outside, right? I think the head of schools for Madison, Connecticut, was talking about having too many standardizations across, especially teaching and learning. You want to leave some of the art to the folks who are doing the work. But at the same time, if you have a really incoherent system, it can create confusion and exhaustion amongst people. So how do you then make sure that what is being done is being done in a way that supports all the levels are supporting each other to move the school system or schools actually forward?
I mean, I think part of this is just, part of this is the realities we're dealing with. If you are running you're a vendor out here and you're trying to build terrific math manipulatives, or you're trying to sell terrific basal readers, and there's 20 or 30 other providers in your space, we never ask you to figure out how to make those other providers deliver a quality product or make sure they're coherent with you. We just say, well, of course you can't be responsible for that. You don't have any control over those other 20 providers. I think the reality of our system is a principal or a superintendent has authority. They have decision-making power. They have the ability to make decisions about staffing, materials to a limited extent over the school or schools they're in charge of. Once we move beyond that, the reality is folks in, at the U.S. Department of Ed, folks in a state education agency, no matter how smart they are, no matter how much they care, no matter what their sense of urgency, our system simply doesn't give them the tools they need to actually be able to render schools effective, to drive good decisions, whether it's operations or instruction. So it's not a question of whether it would be nice if it were otherwise. We could have that philosophic debate if we were going to retool our system of governance. But given the world that we operate in, all those folks can really do is write rules or try to issue mandates that may or may not have teeth and may or may not have an impact. So for me, it's not so much would it be nice if 20 or 30 districts were able to synchronize across hiring or teacher eval or whatnot. The question is, what are the mechanisms for doing that? And outside of voluntary collaboratives, I really just don't think we're particularly well situated to have that happen. So for me, that coherence challenge is one that each superintendent and governing board needs to actually take up and own in their own community.
Absolutely. So let me give you an example, and I was talking about this yesterday afternoon with the EdInsight group. A middle school I visited a few weeks ago, and I won't tell you which district, say within 100 miles of Baltimore City. And sitting with the principal and her team asked questions about what they were doing in terms of supporting students. And these are the programs. This is what she actually listed for me. Wilson Reading, Read 180, System 44, Just Words, Achieve 3000, ST Math, Study Island, Adaptive Math, SRI, DIBBLES, PBS, value-added measures to gauge teacher effectiveness, a teaching framework, district benchmarks, and of course state assessments shifting to PARC. 296 students in the school. Wow. And this is what you had. Of course, my head was swimming, and what I saw, frankly, was overload. So quoting Michael Fullen, how do we move from overload to coherence? At least for these schools.
Well, I think the first thing is all these vendors would probably love to know the name of this district because clearly they're an easy sell.
Yeah. Actually, if you're left out of that list, you feel awful.
Yeah, exactly, if you're not on that list.
I'm sure there were more.
I think when you hear something like that, there's all different kinds of coherence and incoherence, right? There's coherence across institutions, which has a lot of political issues. And then there's simply sort of coherence within your own organization, and are you putting the pieces together in a way that makes sense? I think, unfortunately, it's, and I definitely think of vendors as part of both the problem and part of the solution, because in a sense, nearly everything a school does, it has to buy in one way or another. They typically don't write their own curriculum, fortunately, create their own assessments, program their own software, build their own school buses. And so vendors are part of the solution and part of the problem, but it has not typically been in either the vendor's interest or within the school's capacity necessarily to take a global view as to how these different things work together. With vendors, it's often just a simple interoperability problem. And with schools, it's part of the magic bullet syndrome, which is, the problem is we're doing the wrong things, when in fact, the problem is they're doing things wrongly, no matter what it is they do. And this kind of plethora of random stuff is an example of that.
That I think also part of the struggle we all have as educators sometimes is that with all the policies that are coming down from the federal government and the state government, we seem to be changing every year how we're delivering certain types of programs. And it's causing all of us to try to find something in the immediate moment that will band-aid or fix the problem that's being passed down from the federal government or the state government, and there's no longevity of programs. I think it's very important for districts to be able to state their particular mission, their particular vision, so they can clearly give guidance to a vendor as to what their expectations are. And then you have to work in that coherence together and build a system that will work and cater to your individual district. But if we're constantly changing everything all the time, there will never be accountability. When I was listening to the list that you gave, I thought, you know, that sounds like a resume. Just because somebody has a very nice resume or CV does not mean that they're either effective or efficient. It just means they've, you know, had a lot of marks on their sheet. So we're hitting at the wave tops, and I think if we are really going to have to drill down, there has to be an ability for leadership to work with the people that they're engaging, like vendors, to develop the core curricula for their individual district to meet their community's needs. I get very tired of hearing people talk about public education failing all the time. But you can't succeed if the target gets moved every year. And I think the fact is, in some communities, the challenges are different than other communities. I mean, we all know that poverty is a condition that affects all of us. But in some communities, it's less than in others. And how the delivery is going to work will be different in community A than in community B. In some districts, if you are feeding a child every day and giving them love and making them feel safe, and they're learning a little bit, you're still being successful. That's not failing. You may not be passing standardized accountability tests, but you're taking care of those children. Or in other communities where the children come in and they have good family support and parental engagement and all those kinds of things, then you can build a curricula that will allow them to advance more quickly, and then you can help them succeed. So I think accountability cannot be the same in every district around our nation. It has to be based on those community needs, and likewise, you can't just take one program and implement it and expect that it's going to have the same results in one community that it will have in another. There has to be that flexibility to allow for that creativity and the meeting of those community needs.
So how do you make sure that the definition of proficiency, whatever that may mean, may not mean in the Common Core, to be consistent across the country? Or do you think that it should, or at least the definition of success should move from community to community?
Well, I think that you can have an overall accountability. I don't have a problem with having that. You know, we look in our district just because that's the best example I know of for me, because that's my frame of reference. But we look at Common Core as the floor. That's not something we want to attain. That's something that we begin with. And then we try to work with those students, regardless of where they are in the process, to get them to that level. And so that takes some response to intervention. It takes some additional programming that we utilize our vendors for to help us meet those marks, whether it be Scantron, Fast Forward, all those kind of groups that we've utilized. The fact is, we know the needs of our students, and so we're monitoring them effectively and trying to meet those marks. But we do also set some common goals in our own district that we believe equate to that accountability. For instance, one of our goals is to get every student, when they take the ACT, to reach the score of 24. That's a goal in our district. And the reason that's a goal in our district is because every university in our state requires a 24, especially University of Kentucky, requires a 24 for purposes of admission. Well, to us, whether they can, pass a test proficiently or not is one thing, but getting them to the next level in their educational endeavor is the effectiveness and the appropriate part of the educational format. So again, we try to look at the problems we have. We try to work with our vendors and cater or create something that will work within that community.
And Rick, that list I just read, do you think that's a vendor problem, or do you think it's a school leadership or district leadership problem?
I tend to think, if I go to a mechanic, I expect and I bring a problem to be fixed. I expect the mechanic to, make good judgments about how to fix the problem. But I have to take responsibility that I'm not going to a fly-by-night. I have to take responsibility that I'm not going to somebody who puffs up the bill and kind of sells you extra things you don't need. So I think it's both. I think, I think vendors are not all, the universe of vendors in education is not always an impressive crew. You guys are all familiar with Larry Berger's famous curve from this piece he wrote for me about a decade ago, pointing out that in most markets, you have a handful of big providers, a whole bunch of little providers. Excuse me. In most markets, you have a couple of big providers, a bunch of mid-sized providers, and then a trail. In education, what we have are all of these local kind of tiny consulting operations that are often retired superintendents or associate supes who were selling to their local district, and then used to be 3 or 4 giants, which arguably we're not even at 3 or 4 anymore, and we don't really have much in the way of the middle. And these guys have a certain set of operational incentives, and these guys don't necessarily have much in the way of quality control. So that's a problem with the vendor space, but I mean, I think, Steve and Ed have laid this out, that when you talk to superintendents and school leaders and cabinet members about what they're looking for, they often have no earthly clue. They're not going to vendors saying, hey, I have this problem, can you help me solve it? They sit in a pitch session and they hear about some terrific reading program or math program, and they go, yeah, we want that. Mm-hmm. And if that's your mindset as a district leader or a school leader, what you're going to wind up with a whole bunch of people selling you a whole bunch of encyclopedias that may or may not actually contain the words you want to look up.
I think it's actually even worse than that. So having been a vendor to a bunch of districts in past lifetimes, you are almost never incentivized to do your best work. You're generally incentivized to do your most compliant work, which means to nod and say, oh yeah, you know exactly what you want, and you're right, that's how we should solve it, and yeah, we're gonna cut our prices to the bone in order to have the privilege of doing business with you. And to use your mechanic analogy, it would be like if there was a noise in your car, and you're not a mechanic, but you go to the mechanic and you say, there's this noise, and here, this is the problem, and here are the tools that you have, and I need it back in an hour, but I'm only going to pay 85 cents.
Or you say, hey, you know what? I was at my cousin's in another state. I saw their mechanic. They used this cool new catalytic, omnibus 2000.
So I'm going to evaluate you based on how much your shop looks like his shop.
And I want you to use that because it was really cool and my cousin was satisfied.
Yeah.
And so you wind up, so this is part of the problem with what best practices gets reduced to and data-driven decisions get reduced to is something seems to work for someone you saw at an ASCD conference somewhere and you're like, man, I got to buy that too. And then next Christmas you hear about something else at ASCD, and so what you wind up with is 23 different operations all moving systematically, none of them integrated and nobody having any clue if they how they work with your people.
And if you're a vendor and you try and really be a partner, not just to throw that word around, but you really try and go the extra mile, really learn about the situation on the ground, do a bunch of very thoughtful pilots, are very upfront, that typically doesn't give you any advantage in the procurement process. You're really no farther down the road than you are if you just responded to an RFP. And so I think the incentives currently are not there for vendors to do their best work.
And the vendors can have the greatest product in the world, but if you don't have the implementation, to use the phrase we're all hearing about recently, boots on the ground in the classroom, then if you don't have buy-in from the people that are implementing those resources, it's like having a great computer that has all of these great pieces of technology, and the only thing you're using it for is word processing. I mean, you have to be able to take the resources, have buy-in from your personnel to implement that. And I think that goes to the vision that we talked about earlier, because dispositional hiring is a very key term that's been used lately, as of late. You have to get the kind of employees or players, if you will, in your district that will buy into the operation that or the vision that you have towards success. And then what kind of vendor will fit with those employees that are going to have to ultimately implement it.
The way I like to think about this is, right, we're just early on in the football season, and right at the end of the summer, there's a certain set of cities, and say in the NFL, where everybody is always excited that they have finally got the right parts. Washington, D.C. has been guilty of this for 15 years running now. that their vendors are, whichever agents were representing the free agents that DC went out and signed, whoever's pitching kind of the latest offense, some modification of the West Coast offense or the run and shoot, and you bring this stuff, and the Redskins always go 5-11. And there's other towns where nobody's talking a big game, where they're not out changing the model, they're not out pursuing new vendors, they're not out signing big name talent. And the Green Bays and the New Englands, and they consistently go 12-4 each and every year. And I think what that says to me is that we massively overestimate how much these component parts matter. And what happens is people get so excited about the component parts that they feel that actually is a way to avoid having to do the hard work of getting the organization focused and disciplined and attuned to kind of, here is how we do things around here. And I think it's a lesson that's easy to miss. And each time, especially in education, where we have such a sense of urgency, where everybody is so eager to make a big difference fast, that it turns out that being patient, being disciplined, can actually work against you. And so people say, I want somebody who's going to go out there and make a difference fast, darn it. And that can actually encourage, I think, destructive behaviors.
And Steve, you said that, by the way, that could be a Yankees discussion as well too, right? So great players, but not a great team. You said that vendors at times are part of the solution and part of the problem. Say more about that.
Vendors respond to the incentives that they're given. And to the opportunities that they're given. So if you have a decision-making process or a purchasing process or a piloting process that really seems to value thoughtfulness and transparency on the part of, let's say, a vendor, where it helps them in the sales relationship later on, then people will naturally gravitate towards that. But if you have procurement processes that the purchasing officer believes makes it illegal, for example, for you to have certain kinds of conversations with vendors, then you're not going to have those conversations, and both parties are going to be more in the dark than they would have been otherwise. And so vendors then will see the writing on the wall and will say, well, this is how I get the sale, because at the end of the day, that's what matters. And as a vendor, that's what has to matter. And so you're not really given the opportunity to be part of the solution in that sense, so you go for the faster buck. I think, Rick, the thing that you were saying a second ago about, the inability to be patient and to think well about choices, I think also goes to this question of the emphasis that we put on changing policy. That we think that, if we have new policies, the things that people campaign on and are elected on and that superintendents get hired for, whether it's curriculum issues or it's accountability issues or it's tenure issues, and those things never ultimately at the end of the day seem to make that much difference compared to how important we thought they were. And I think that has to do with the way school districts do things, not so much the things they do, but how they do them.
I agree. I want to go back to a piece you talked about, Ed. One thing I learned a long time ago as a school superintendent was that the federal policies, frankly, didn't mean much to my community. When they were announcing the NCLB, city schools, that seldom made the paper. In fact, my parents couldn't care less about that. But the one thing I learned from mentors and from other folks was that every city has one metric by which it measures success. And make sure you scratch that itch. And if you do, you can blow up the place, no one will care. And in different cities, are nuance. It's nuance, right? So in Rochester, New York, it was the graduation rate. That number was a big deal. In Chicago, it was access to a good neighborhood school. And I would argue in DC, it's having a good school in your neighborhood, right? So making sure that data point is what people look to, I think, is important. So the question for me is then, if you're looking to come to a district to solve a particular problem or help, I think understanding that data point that you mentioned, community, might be something that vendors ought to try to understand, right?
I think that's very true. I mean, and I came from the National School Board Association, and one thing we're trying to communicate to the legislators at the federal and state level is that the local districts need the flexibility to use the funds that they receive to do what they need to do within their community. You can't govern from 3,000 miles away or 2,000 miles away, or in the case of my state, even 120 miles away from northern Kentucky to Frankfort. You have to be able to govern within your community. And you know, a lot of the people that are telling us how to run our programs are people that have never stepped foot inside of our school buildings. And that's very frustrating. I think what has to happen is that the local groups have to work directly with the vendors, and it shouldn't be a cookie cutter type system. I mean, I understand the vendor has a baseline program, but things can be tweaked and adjusted and moved around so that they fit a particular district's needs. Going back to the computer analogy I had before, you can find bells and whistles on the computers, but there's going to be 4 or 5 things that system will do if it's fully utilized that will work and make that an effective machine for you. And I think we have to work with our vendors to do that. You know, the vendors, part of the issue for vendors is I don't fault the vendors in the sense of that they are trying to make sales. They are trying to stay in a very competitive market and be successful. But on the other side of the coin, the vendor needs to know from the district that we have certain expectations, we have certain visions and goals, and we need to know whether or not you can meet those objectives. And so I think that going to what you were saying a moment ago, that if you have that one issue within your community and you know that you've got to scratch that itch, so to speak, and you've got to meet this particular type of quota or whatever you want to call it, then you have to be able to craft a system with the help of those vendors that will allow you to take care of those particular needs. I think it also goes to what Steve was saying a little while ago. Just because it works in one other district and you like that and you saw that result, it does not mean it's going to have the same impact in your district, because every district is its own living and breathing organism that has to survive on its own accord. And so I think some of the times that there's this relationship that's brought together between a vendor and a district, and we all have good relationships, but we haven't drilled down to what needs are we really filling. And can the vendor meet those needs, or has the district explained to the vendor, these are the needs that have to be met?
When you look at, and Stephen, this may be for you, when you look at most school districts and their leaders, many of us are instructional people, right? And often the student information system, the busing operations, everything impacts student learning. How do you help a school leader or school district leader really understand how important these things are to the bottom line, the improvement of the academic achievement of students?
I'm gonna guess that most school leaders, it's not that they're unaware that those things matter, or it's not that they're unaware that if it takes them 1.5 years to execute a contract on some core instructional curriculum or piece of technology, not only is it going to be too late, but they're only going to be able to work with vendors who are also happy to wait 1.5 years to close that deal. I don't think it's necessarily that school leaders are unaware of it. It's that things like procurement and contracting in IT are kept mysterious by the people who run them, and people who run them will often say, well, that's not legal, or it's against regulations. And I did this a couple times at the DOE, asked people to actually point to the law or the regulation. In fact, a lot of times they don't exist. It's just the culture of that organization. It's what they were taught their first time on the job. But because of the way things are politicized, a procurement scandal, I'm going to guess, is one of the most frightening things that a superintendent could undergo. And so it's sort of like, well, it's not that broke, so let's not try to fix it, because they only see typically risk in changing those systems. It's not what they were hired to do. They were hired to raise the graduation rate. Why risk the argument with the school board? So I think it takes a certain willingness, and it has to come down from the top, because those parts of the organization won't change on their own. It needs a really clear message that, hey, you guys are not in the compliance business. You guys are in the problem-solving business. We all have the same set of problems to solve. We all have a different piece of the solution that's in our wheelhouse. And you guys on the ops side are just as much accountable for the decisions we make and the tools we use. And so I don't want to hear, no, we can't do that. I want to hear, okay, it's going to be tough, but this is how I think we can get there.
One of those things, Steve, has to be that engagement piece, because I've been in a district that you have a superintendent and a board, and they tolerated one another.
Yeah.
But they didn't effectively work together. And when you have a situation like that, then what happens is the superintendent's worried about his own personal well-being and his longevity, so he caters himself to make sure he takes care of what the board wants, at least 3 members of the board if it's a 5-member board. So as opposed to a group where you have an engagement between a superintendent and the board working together and understanding their perfect role, the superintendent being the managerial leader of the district and the board members being the liaison to the community and getting the support from the community for the district. The boards that I've seen that are successful are boards that are directly involved. They don't just meet once a month and cater to the public or to the TV that's recording them. They basically are involved in the committees. They're on the technology committee. They're on the teaching and learning committee. They're on the budget committee. And so they know the reason these funds are being put into a particular procurement or put to a particular use, because they understand how it fits into the whole context of everything. And so the problem with that becomes that when you have elections every 4 years for board members and you have a constant change, in our state we change about 1/3 of our board members every election cycle. And so then what happens is the superintendent doesn't like the new board, he moves on, and you're constantly in this ever-changing rotation where nothing has a life that is long enough to achieve success. And so I think that we have to be more focused on engaging one another towards this idea of accountability and success.
So one of my last, I guess, big questions is going to go, of course, back to Common Core, right? So do you think the incoherence in systems is causing some of the angst that we see right now in Common Core? Talking about implementation, professional development, data systems, technology, all the stuff that has to come together for sort of a real good execution of the standards.
I think in my district, people fear the Common Core. And what I mean by fear it is, we have a group that comes every month to our board meeting and talks about this being the government takeover of education. Yeah. They don't understand what is trying to be accomplished here. Common Core is basically a guideline set of principles. Every district has the ability to implement and get to that point how they need to get there. So it's like going to a destination and having a variety of roads or methodologies to get there. You can fly, you can drive, you can walk, you can take this road, you can take this interstate. The idea is we ultimately want to get to the end, which is success and accountability. And I think people fear that Common Core is this way for the government to take over, to be totally in control. And frankly, we've got an election cycle right now where 2 of our candidates, our local board members, are being opposed by people that buy into that type of philosophy. And so when they come in, if they were to be elected and were to come in, they would then want to put a cutoff to the funding of anything that would represent the state or federal government, which disrupts your entire flow within your educational environment. So until we get the community on board, and that's the magic $1 million question, is how do we get everybody to buy in to what is in the best interest of our students?
So just to add the word communications for me is also part of the coherence in terms of making things move. And one thing I've learned, frankly, in the last few years is that can be as important as the work itself, making sure that you're communicating in a way that people understand.
So I think one thing, we talk about coherence, I had just touched on this, that part of the dynamics of having school systems led by appointed or elected boards is this notion that the decisions should be driven by folks in the community. And what happens is those, whenever we're in favor of this or that reform, it always seems to us kind of self-evident that this is good and right and helpful for kids, whether we're for No Child Left Behind or whether we're excited about Race at the Top or value-added metrics or implementation of the Common Core or what have you. And there's a tendency to think that anybody else who's not enthusiastic is obviously a nut job who doesn't get it. And therefore, that's a failure of communication on our part.
Absolutely.
And if we just say it the right way, they will see how much smarter we are than them, and they will finally get on board. So for me, part of the way the incoherence issue arises with Common Core is Ed's exactly right. Common Core is, a bunch of words on paper. I always compare it to like the mission statement at McDonald's. You want your food to be delivered fast and courteously and to be delicious. And that may or may not have anything to do with your actual experience. But the Common Core also is sold as promoting a number of instructional shifts. 70% informational text at high school, but not in your English class, which means that in theory you're going to be doing close to 2 hours of informational reading outside of English for each hour in English, which means that you're now going to spend a lot of time in chemistry or biology reading, those EPA reports or what have you. I think it's a reasonable question about whether having kids spend a lot of time reading EPA reports in biology or chemistry is actually an instructional improvement over what existed before. Common Core implies an embrace of close reading. The idea that kids should read only the text in front of them and not bring their personal interpretation and not make connections beyond the boundaries of the text. That's fine. When I taught high school a long, long time ago, I actually did a fair bit of this in social studies. I didn't know it was called close reading. But there is this underlying assumption, like with the Lexile reading, that this is the right way to educate all kids, grades K to 12, at all times, everywhere in the country. I think part of the pushback is that people don't follow these things closely. All they know is their state adopted Common Core when they weren't paying attention, and now they're hearing a lot of stuff. And people get nervous and concerned. Personally, I think there's a lot of legitimate reasons to wonder how this shakes out. I find some of the called for instructional shifts disconcerting myself. And what that's going to do is create tumult and discord and disagreement. And we can call it incoherence. But I think another way to think about it is that when you've got a country with 50 million children and 100,000 schools, and you're running a district of 20,000 kids or even 2,000 kids, there's going to be some fair bit of disagreement and confusion. And one way to kind of steer with that is not, when you're on an icy road and your car goes out of control, there's this temptation to kind of turn it right, and what happens is your actual tires lock up, and what you want to do is steer into the turn. And I think what happens is our tendency is to double down on messaging, double down on our communication, and I think oftentimes we'd be better if we steered into the turn more on these things.
Good point.
I think relatively little of the objection that Ed's experiencing on Common Core has to do with people who are deeply informed about what kids are going to be reading in chemistry class. I think that it's funny that you said people are worried about a takeover by the government. Education is a government service.
Right.
There are three things that states do. They educate, medicate, incarcerate, right? Any governor will tell you that's where 90% of the budget goes. And what's funny about education is that it's it's an anomalous government service, because we expect to have stakeholder voice at the parent level in a way that we don't for any other government service. You don't like what your teacher's doing, you get to go see the principal. And if you don't like what the principal says, you get to see the superintendent. Then you get to go to the school board. Try that at the police precinct.
Exactly.
And see how far it gets you. Try that at the Department of Sanitation. And so I do think there's a lot of anxiety about government, a lot of anxiety about corporatization. The disaster of In Bloom, I think, was substantially a messaging disaster in a lot of ways. But it's not just that people are concerned about educational data or government overreach in education. They're concerned about the datafication of their kids in general out in the culture. And they can't tell Google to stop taking pictures of their house. They can't tell the healthcare agencies to stop selling their prescription information, but they can push back at school because they have agency. They can push back on stuff like Common Core because they have agency. And so I think we catch in education a lot of anxiety that doesn't actually originate here. And then, of course, you get people who act in education who have very specific interests that they exploit, that they use these concerns to exploit for other reasons.
Yeah, I think anxiety is anxiety, whether it's real or imagined. And so I think a lot of times sometimes it is real. There are some serious problems, I believe, with Common Core. But I also believe that another part of the problem is the imagined fear, the fear of what might come of it. I think that at the end of the day, we have to come to identification of the problem and seek the solution that best fits. I mean, the Common Core is not going to be perfect. In Kentucky, we're well aware of reform because in 1990, our entire educational system was declared unconstitutional, from funding to education and curriculum implementation. So we had to start over. And it wasn't perfect, and we've had to make changes, and that's where site-based councils came from. But at the end of the day, people working together, moving in a true direction, we're able to make progress. And so our system today, it's not clean and neat, but it's a lot better than it used to be. And I think that's what you have to do with these reforms, is you have to learn to take what is productive and positive and strip that off, and then get rid of or extricate those things that are not working. And I think we have to get away from the idea that it's black and white. It's not black and white. What's success in one community is not going to be the definition of success in another.
I mean, I think that's well said. But I think this angst point you made too, Ed, is really useful, is we have this habit, at least in the education debates, again, it seems to me that many people who I regard as kind of my friends and in the reform community tend to be astonished that people don't get it, that they're not on board with these simpletons. And so, you know, when we talk about the Common Core, then we say, look, they don't understand. It's not a government takeover. Well, I mean, actually, I think there's a lot more to it than that. There's President Obama being credited in the 2012 Democratic National Platform. There's President Obama tapping himself on the chest and crediting himself in 2011 and 2013 in the State of the Union. There's certainly the SEA waivers. There's the fact that there's race at the top. There's right now that the U.S. Department of Ed is trying to figure out how they decide whether or not state assessments meet muster if they're not Parker SBAC. There's a lot of kind of slippery slope stuff that goes on here. But I think the larger question is, when people lashed out at President Bush over his Iraq strategy, I don't recall that the New York Times spent a lot of time saying, is it just politics or are they actually upset? It was understood that, you know, when we're dealing with public decisions, that some of angst may be imagined or exaggerated, but usually we recognize that this stuff is stirred in with real and legitimate concerns, and we tend to treat it as a real and legitimate part of the conversation. What I think is striking sometimes about how we deal with ed reform is, for instance, the Common Core in particular. It's been striking to me how many times this year criticisms have been met with push-pulls. When, you know, somebody is funded to go do a survey which says, hey, there's this thing called the Common Core which sets high standards for all children, is internationally benchmarked, and really insists that kids learn reading and math, or are you opposed to that and you hate puppies? Mm-hmm. And they come back and they say 83% of people like this. And my question is, who are the other 17%? But you know, that's actually not a response to this mishmash of angst, some legitimate and perhaps some more imagined or ungrounded. But I think whether we're talking about this at a district level or a national policy level, or as vendors dealing with shaky folks at states and districts, we tend to do better when we presume the legitimacy of concerns and are less in a hurry to kind of tell people, if you guys really understood, you would agree with me.
So please prepare your questions. We'll be coming in about 1 minute for your questions. That's a great point. You know, listening to Mark Tucker this morning, and having heard him at ECS a few months ago, the idea that today's reform, I think that the ones who invented education reform, is also part of the problem, I think, across our nation. That we've had many iterations of reform, and we don't really build. So it goes back to the coherence issue, right? We don't learn from what we've done 10, 20 years ago and keep building sort of iteratively getting to what we're supposed to actually get to. So questions, folks? Anybody? 2 microphones.
Hi, I'm Kina Antonelli with Promethean. I'm actually going to address this in my previous role as an educator. And early on, when you guys were listing off that long list of all the different tools that were available in that particular district, and you know, kind of the collective reaction was, oh, that's really bad, that shouldn't exist. I guess for me as an educator, I think of that as my toolkit. And I think a challenge we have as vendors is quite often we have this pressure to come in and tell a district, you know, our tool does everything for everybody and everybody's going to have success from using this one tool, and you can get rid of all the other ones because ours does everything. But as a teacher in a classroom, that would be like coming in and saying, you know what, pencils are fantastic. We've seen great work with pencils, and we think everybody should use pencils from the minute they walk in to the minute they walk out. It's a tool. And I think we have this pressure to essentially say, you know, the tool I'm offering you gets rid of all other tools and use it all the time for every kid. But then we turn to teachers and say, personalize instruction and meet the needs of all 130 kids that you see during that middle school day. So do you think is there room to essentially come into a district and say, you know what, my tool will do fantastic things for some of the kids some of the time? Is that still valid?
I think that's a great point, and I'm really, really glad that you clarified that, because I think optimally, certainly in my experience and from my perspective, you do want people, you want teachers and principals to have access to the greatest range of tools that they can, so that they can choose the right tool for the right job, the right teacher, the right kid. And so it's totally fair to say that just because somebody rattles off a laundry list doesn't necessarily mean it's incoherent. It could just be that people in that school have a tremendously wide range of options. I guess my reaction initially to those particular products was that a lot of them were pretty basal and pretty comprehensive. And so my reaction was, gee, I don't know that they have a really strong sense of what their instructional approach is to a school, and then have a lot of different sort of supplements and supports to help them get there. I think that's a really, really fair point, though, and I guess you want to find a balance between having some core thoughts about what instructional approaches work well in your school, and it could be 3 or 4, but at the same time having a really wide range of supports to help you get there.
And as a board member who believes that the quality teacher in the classroom is the core of student achievement, I do believe that there should be resources available. The problem from a governance perspective, having sit on the board, is you also have to look to professional development. These are not the types of programs that you can come in and do one training and then you're good to go for the rest of your teaching career. These are things that have to have ongoing professional development, which require dollars to be placed with that program. And so if you are so broad in all of your programs, and if you're trying to be great at everything, you don't have quality at the other items that you need to have quality on. So if you try to please everyone, the old saying, you try to please everyone, you please no one. If you try to buy all of these products and have them as resources, then you're only going to be able to touch the surface of what they can actually do. On the other hand, I do think it's good to have multiple resources, because I also believe from the vendor environment, or the vendor space, that competition between them drives quality and productivity. And I think when a vendor fears that they might lose a contract with the district because somebody else can provide a better solution, that's going to drive that particular vendor to answer their own problem internally to keep up with the changing trends.
What the guys just said actually reminds me of a really useful distinction that I've worked with, sometimes come up with districts I work with, which is, one way to think about this is if you're in medicine, you think differently about buying an X-ray and about a physical therapy regime. An X-ray is an investment. You buy it. It's a piece of equipment. You have it. It's pretty simple. You've got somebody on staff who just uses it to do something. Physical therapy regimen is something where you actually need staff who know how to use a series of tools with the client in a variety of ways over a period of time. So part of what comes up here is we tend not to think very discreetly about this stuff. These are products, and we buy them, and we plug them into schools, and we need some PD, but we tend not to think about who's the PD for, who uses this, how complicated is it to use. And I think this is actually part of the coherence thing again, that when you're out procuring these things and bringing them into your organization, do you have a clear idea in mind of what it will take for this stuff to be used in a way that's going to make a real difference for kids? And I think a lot of times we don't necessarily have a clear game plan on the front end.
I think that's, it's to overuse an overused word. The ecosystem of stuff that you work with in a school determines how effective any one of those products is going to be. To continue the medical model, there are interactions, right? Some of them are positive, some of them are negative, between the use models of different services. And sometimes 1 + 1 is 3, and sometimes 1 + 1 is 0. So both vendors and school leaders need to be thoughtful about the overall mix.
And the word we constantly use is capacity. It's not that we don't think your product is a great product. The issue is within our particular district, do we have the capacity within our district to use it to its full potential?
And it goes back to your piece about vertical and horizontal alignment as well too, right? So if you have a good system where school leaders are identifying issues, or presenting themselves through students, and you as a district or procurement office providing solutions, that can be customized to individual students. So the laundry list didn't worry me. The question that worried me in this school was, why do you have these things? What needs did you identify? And you could clearly see there was no strategy behind those things being there. So having that kind of system where you're getting feedback organically from schools and creating solutions at the top level for schools, I think is really critical and important. Anyone else, please?
I'm Susan Mel with MMS Education, and you've been talking a lot about your procurement processes, sort of that review, evaluation, approval process. How does OER play into that? Is that disrupting that? Do you put it through the same kind of review evaluation process? Or are you allowing teachers and even at the building level to go out and use any kind of open free resources that they want? How is that playing in?
I mean, when you don't have to cut a check for something, it obviously makes it easier to get inside the organization. And that can be good and that can be bad. Typically, I think it's good. When you're talking about OER, it becomes more completely an instructional decision, or at least it should be. And then depending on the organization, you can devolve the authority for that decision down to the teacher level or to the principal level or district level. I mean, I think certainly OER, as well as all of the other free products that teachers have access to, tends to increase the diversity of stuff that's available in the classroom. Which is good if you like the idea of people having access to tools. It's less good, again, along the lines of, do you really have the capacity to deeply support and integrate that stuff? Certainly bypasses procurement.
Anyone else? We have a few minutes left.
Oh, just one last thing about that. One of the problems that gets thrown off around OER, the other big to-do the last year around central policy making aside from Common Core was in bloom. And so around OER, because it's not typically going through a district platform, literally or figuratively, there's a concern about what's happening with that student data. And this is, of course, the case with free services in general. So even the fact that it bypasses one set of policies around procurement doesn't necessarily mean it's bypassing another set of policies around FERPA and student data disclosure and things like that, which also creates a lot of anxiety and a lot of pushback. So even that's complicated.
I think it's fair to say there's a lot of moving parts in a, it doesn't matter the size of the system. There's a lot of moving parts. There's vendors, there's teachers, there's professional development, there's administrators, there's pieces moving at all times because teachers transfer from one school to another school, or they may move to a different district. And I think what we started this with, when I talked about the alignment, is we want to have at least a loose structure in place that if a teacher transitions from one school within our district to another school within our district, they don't have to start over with a whole type of different resources. They can have a basic format, or they can get the training that they need. We have coaches in our district, so we have coaches in every school that work directly with the teachers to make sure that whatever program or whatever vendor supply they're using, they're up to speed with how to implement and integrate that. And I think that it still allows for creativity, because how one teacher teaches may be entirely different from how somebody else teaches. And they both can be great teachers. It's how they utilize that product and how they've gotten the training and how they've received the support that they need to get to that ultimate accomplishment, which is trying to be accountable for student success.
I think we can begin to close with one statement I heard this earlier today. You have a question? Oh, sure, absolutely.
As a superintendent, I just have a question for the industry, kind of looking over the horizon and seeing how things are unfolding. The Common Core is typically framed as guideposts and so forth, and as goals to reach. But Rick pointed out something pretty important that I think is going under the radar in the debate around the Common Core, and that's the instructional shifts that are happening. It's kind of insider baseball talk. So from a parent's perspective, it's not something that really hits home until your child brings home the new math, and then suddenly it goes on YouTube and it becomes the buzz. And as a superintendent, I can make a case for decomposition of numbers, that a second grader should know that 32 is 3 10s and 2 1s, and if you're going to add 21, you're going to add 2 more 10s and 2 more and 1 more 1 and so forth. What I can't make a case for as superintendent is that all kids must do math that way, which is explicitly what the standards state. So the rigidity of the Common Core is a concern from an educator. So with that in mind, and what I see as more of a standardization and a homogenization of education, what are the implications for this field? Because you probably can make a case that that's a good thing for the field here, or it might not be a good thing for smaller startups and smaller companies and smaller vendors. I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Before you guys jump, just to add to your point, I have a now 8th grader in New York State who brought home the package of math stuff, and I taught physics at the high school level, physics and chemistry. And it took me a while to figure out how to help her study for the math assessment. So my fear is that the assessment is going to drive how we teach, how the standards. And that, frankly, for me is the fear in the whole conversation. I don't think the standards tell you how to teach, but I'm afraid the assessment will actually dictate how we actually do things. Gentlemen?
I think that's a great point. I mean, frankly, I was disturbed with math when they started putting numbers and letters together. You know, I mean, math was never my strong suit, but I understand the need for math. I understand that in the areas that jobs are available in science and industry and those kind of things, that's important. But I think that's a very good point. I don't think that there's one set way that's always the right way. I think there are other ways to get there. And to the degree that it tries to pigeonhole us into this idealized concept that there's only one right way, I completely agree with your statement. On the other hand, I think the intent was good. I just don't know that the outcome is good. I think the same with No Child Left Behind. I mean, who can argue that we don't want any child left behind? That wasn't the problem. The problem was in the details and in the implementation. And like a lot of government programs, it's a shotgun blast. And it goes out there, and some pellets make contact, and some of them don't. And I think we have to get away from the idea that this is the way it's going to be, it's not going to change. We have to be open to the idea of creativity and understand that there's more than one way to deal with the problem. There's more than one solution.
And I think that vendors, by and large, take a range of, however prescriptive Common Core is, and whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, vendors take a really wide range of approach to that, sometimes consciously and sometimes just with the very liberal and generous use of the Common Core aligned phrase. Yes. On a product that was created 10 years before the Common Core. So, I mean, certainly in my experience, I don't see necessarily that simply because Common Core tends to bias very heavily towards certain ways of doing things, that the products end up all looking similar. It seems to me there's still a really wide range of implementation towards those goals.
I think for the industry, actually, I think it makes it easier for small-scale ventures to get in and scale. Because one of the things it does is it clarifies around what districts are looking for. So normally when you've gone in, right, it's the old Texas, California textbook adoption question, that when you know what these guys are looking for, you know, the problem is you try to write through those hoops, and it was only the guys big enough to have the sales forces to get into Texas and California, and then you could just tweak for everywhere else. Well, now suddenly, to the extent that everybody is looking for the same basic components when they're looking for ELA or math, it gives vendors a clearer target, which means that you don't necessarily have to have as substantial a sales force on the front end. It means that you can actually sell more on the deliverable, which I think, I think, you know, one of the healthy dynamics is it makes it easier. We've already seen it, I think, in some of the teacher lesson plan sharing space, for instance. So you see with like the Learn Zillions and the Share My Lessons and the Better Lessons, it's much easier for them to build what they're building than it would have been even 5 years ago. But the cost of this, of course, is I think there is precisely this homogenization that you flag, and which we see routinely in any industry where you see kind of providers congeal around a set of industry standards, whether that's, you know, VHS over Betamax, or whether that's smartphone signals, or whether it's the App Store configuration. Usually we think that's obviously a good trade-off because the upside out. In this case, I'm not sure that we're going to be as happy with the trade-off as we are in those cases. Personally, I think it might be a net negative trade-off, but I do think that you get those benefits on the vendor side.
Okay. Go ahead, Vicky. Last words, comments?
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to have the discussion. I mean, obviously, I frankly, you've heard a lot of us speak. I love the question and answer sessions because I learn what other people are thinking about and what our ideas and experiences might offer to you. I think all of us will be around here at the front for a while. Yeah. If anyone wants to come up and has additional questions, I really think the dialogue's interesting. I think it shows how different frame of references and different ideas can be discussed with an idea or goal or objective in mind that we're all here to achieve the same ultimate result, which is success.
Yeah. And last thing I'll add is, it's working into cities as school superintendent, I always appreciated when a vendor came inside with me or my executive team and asked me about my strategy, my goals, the issues in my district, before trying to sell me something. Genuine or not, it made me feel better that people were trying to understand what I was looking to actually accomplish. And I could fit the solution that I was hearing into a particular part of my strategy and create coherence for my folks. So that, if it's worth anything, I think it's always worthwhile to be that kind of engaging with a leader to really understand what he or she is trying to actually accomplish as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for an excellent session. Really,
Thanks, guys.